They trusted the system to protect their children. Police reports, court dates, waiting. But waiting has a cost. When the accusations surfaced, the men were still free, still walking, still close. And for these mothers, something broke. This is not about justice served. It's about the moment a line was crossed and the law was left behind. It starts in a small courtroom, when a mother stands up, and the trial never gets to continue. Ellie Nesler, Tuolumne County, California. In the early 1990s, Tuolumne County was the kind of place where court days drew crowds. Small towns fed into one courthouse, and when something serious happened, everyone knew who was involved before the doors even opened. Ellie Nesler lived there with her young son. She was a single mother, working and raising him in a community where people trusted familiarity more than distance. That trust began to erode when allegations surfaced against a local man named Daniel Mark Driver. Driver was not new to the system. He had prior convictions for child molestation and had already served time. After his release, he returned to the same area, close to families who knew his history and feared it repeating. By the early 1990s, new accusations emerged. Several boys came forward. Among them was Ellie's son. The aftermath unfolded slowly. Interviews, medical examinations, meetings that reduced private trauma to formal questions. Driver was arrested and charged, but the case moved through the court system at a deliberate pace. Hearings were scheduled weeks apart, each one prolonging uncertainty. Parents began filling the courtroom benches. They listened as allegations were discussed in restrained legal language, stripped of emotion and urgency. Outside the courthouse, anger and fear spread faster than any official update. April 2, 1993, was set for another hearing at Jamestown Justice Court. It was procedural, not a trial, and no final outcome was expected that day. The courtroom was crowded. Court staff moved through tight aisles. Deputies stood near the walls. Driver sat at the defense table, unrestrained, waiting. Ellie Nesler entered and took her place in the gallery. Hidden beneath her clothing was a small caliber handgun. When the hearing was underway, she stood up. There was no argument, no shouted accusation. She stepped forward and fired. The first shot struck Driver. A second followed moments later. He collapsed at the defense table and died on the courtroom floor. The room erupted. People screamed. Deputies moved in. Ellie did not flee. She surrendered the weapon and was taken into custody. Within hours, the case was national news. A mother had killed her child's accused abuser inside a courtroom. Headlines debated motive before the blood had dried. Ellie was charged with murder. Her defense centered on psychological collapse. A mother overwhelmed by fear, rage, and a justice process she believed could not protect her child. Prosecutors focused on preparation, intent, and location, describing the act as calculated rather than spontaneous. The legal process stretched on. Mistrials, appeals, procedural reversals. Years passed before the case reached resolution. Ellie eventually entered a plea to voluntary manslaughter. At sentencing, the judge was unequivocal. This was nothing more than an execution. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. After her release, her life did not settle. Legal problems continued. Health issues followed. In 2008, Ellie Nesler died after a public battle with cancer. The Jamestown courthouse remains quiet today. Hearings still begin on time. Benches still fill and empty. But the case left behind a question that never fully closed, because for the next mother, there would be no courtroom, no waiting period, and no chance to act after the fact. Bruce Pierce, Indianapolis, Indiana. By 2025, Bruce Pierce was already embedded in the system meant to prevent repeat harm. He had been convicted twice in 2016 for child molestation offenses, convictions serious enough to place him on Indiana's sexually violent predator registry. His name was recorded, his address tracked, and his risk formally acknowledged. What the system could not do was remove him from proximity. In May of that year, a hotel in Indianapolis became the setting. The mother was staying there with her children for a short period of time, the kind of temporary arrangement that relies on locks, hallways, and the assumption that strangers will remain strangers. Pierce made his way into the family's room while the mother was away. The exact path he took would later be examined in detail, But the result was simple. He was inside, and the door that was meant to separate safety from threat no longer did. When the mother returned, she found him in the room with her young daughter. The situation was unfolding in real time. There was no argument, no prolonged exchange, and no realistic option to step away without abandoning the child. Whatever protections existed outside the room were no longer relevant inside it. The mother was legally armed. She fired once. The assault stopped. Pierce was critically injured and taken to a hospital. He survived. The mother gathered her children and removed them from the room, then contacted authorities. In the hours that followed, confusion set in. Pierce was not immediately secured, forcing investigators to locate him while simultaneously reconstructing what had occurred inside the hotel. Surveillance footage, access records, and timelines were pulled apart minute by minute. Once identified, Pierce's history resurfaced in full. The prior convictions, the registry status, the warnings that had existed long before the hotel stay ever began. The charges that followed reflected both the present incident and the past that framed it. Attempted rape, attempted child molestation, confinement, and unlawful possession of a firearm tied to his criminal record. The mother was not charged. Public reaction focused less on her decision in that moment and more on the gap that allowed the moment to exist at all. The mechanisms designed to warn and restrict had functioned on paper, yet they had failed at the point where proximity turned into danger. This case did not end with a courtroom confrontation or years of waiting. It ended in the instant a threat became unavoidable. And years earlier, across the Atlantic, another mother would act only after the damage was already done, when interruption was no longer possible and only consequence remained. Sarah Sands, East London, England. By the early 2000s, Michael Pleasted was a known presence in Canning Town. His name carried history. He was a convicted paedophile who had served prison time and returned to live among families who remembered exactly why he had been removed in the first place. His release unsettled the area. Parents spoke quietly about Ruth's home, about supervision, about what the law allowed once a sentence was complete. The fear was not dramatic, but it was constant, embedded in daily routine. Sarah Sands lived nearby with her children. She was a working mother in a dense, close-knit neighborhood where people shared walls, stairwells, and information. When new allegations surfaced that Pleasted had abused children again, the old fear sharpened into something immediate. The case was entering the legal system. Statements were taken. Investigations opened. But the process moved at the pace it always does, measured and procedural, built to withstand scrutiny rather than panic. For Sands, that pace felt intolerable. Over time, her mental state deteriorated. Friends and later court proceedings described a woman overwhelmed by anxiety, anger, and the belief that children had already been harmed while authorities deliberated. In late November 2014, Sands went to Pleasted's flat in Canning Town. What happened next was brief. She stabbed him repeatedly. Pleasted died at the scene. Police arrived quickly. Sands did not attempt to escape. She was arrested and charged with murder. The case immediately became a flashpoint. The victim's criminal history dominated headlines. Public opinion split sharply between those who viewed Sands as a mother pushed beyond endurance and those who warned that sympathy could not override the rule of law. At trial in the Old Bailey, the central issue was not whether Sands had killed Pleasted, but why. Her defense focused on loss of control, arguing that her actions were driven by cumulative psychological strain rather than premeditation. Prosecutors pressed the case for murder, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the act. The jury rejected the murder charge. They returned a verdict of manslaughter. At sentencing, the judge described the circumstances as extraordinary. Sands received a prison sentence of 3.5 years, a decision that immediately drew national attention. Victims' advocates, legal commentators, and politicians questioned whether the punishment reflected the gravity of the killing. The debate did not remain theoretical. The Attorney General's office formally challenged the sentence, arguing it was unduly lenient. In January 2016, the Court of Appeal agreed and increased the sentence to 7.5 years. The ruling reinforced a boundary the courts were unwilling to blur. Personal anguish, however severe, could not place someone beyond criminal responsibility. Sands was returned to prison. Her case became a reference point in discussions about vigilantism, parental fear, and the limits of empathy in the justice system. It endured not because it resolved those questions, but because it exposed how little resolution the law can offer when harm is feared rather than conclusively proven. Because unlike the previous case, this was not an interruption. It was an act that came after belief had hardened, after fear had settled in, and after waiting felt indistinguishable from failure. And for the next mother, revenge would take a slower form, one measured not in moments, but in years spent forcing the system to reopen a closed door. Carol Dodge, Idaho Falls, Idaho. On June 13, 1996, Angie Dodge was found murdered in her apartment in Idaho Falls. She was 18 years old. The crime scene was violent and intimate, leaving behind evidence that suggested a single attacker and a struggle that ended quickly. For her mother, Carol Dodge, the days that followed collapsed into one long wait for answers. Police moved fast. Within months, a young man named Christopher Tapp was arrested. He had no prior history of violent crime, but investigators focused on him early. Interrogations stretched for hours. Over time, Tapp gave statements that investigators treated as confessions, though they were inconsistent and changed repeatedly. In 1998, Tapp was convicted of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. At first, Carol Dodge believed the case was over. She believed the right man had been found. Like many families, she wanted certainty more than complexity, an ending more than doubt. But doubt crept in anyway. The DNA evidence from the crime scene did not match Christopher Tapp. Prosecutors argued it could belong to an accomplice who was never found. The conviction stood, but the explanation never fully settled. Years passed. Appeals failed. Tapp remained in prison. Carol Dodge began to question what she had once accepted. Her focus shifted from punishment to proof. She pressed for retesting, for independent review, for any method that could bring clarity rather than closure built on assumption. She became relentless. As technology advanced, she followed it. When genetic genealogy emerged as a tool capable of identifying suspects through distant family matches, she pushed investigators to use it. It was the same technique that had begun cracking cold cases across the country. Eventually, the case reopened. DNA from the crime scene was run through genealogical databases. Family trees were built. Names narrowed. One man emerged, Brian Drips, who had lived near Angie Dodge at the time of the murder. In 2019, investigators recovered a discarded cigarette butt linked to Drips. The DNA matched. He was arrested soon after. Drips confessed. He said he acted alone. With that, the case turned inside out. Christopher Tapp was exonerated after spending more than 2 decades behind bars. His conviction was vacated. The sentence dissolved. Carol Dodge stood publicly and acknowledged the shift. She spoke openly about how her need for justice had changed shape over time, from wanting someone to pay to needing the truth no matter where it led. Her fight had not ended with revenge. It ended with correction. But the years lost could not be returned. Not to her daughter. Not to the man who had lived inside a cell for a crime he did not commit. In this case, vengeance never came through violence. It came through persistence. And in another country, where systems offered far less space for correction, a mother would take justice into her own hands and pay for it with her life. Miriam Rodriguez Martinez, San Fernando, Tamaulipas, Mexico. By 2012, San Fernando was already marked by absence. People vanished quietly, often without witnesses and rarely with consequences. Kidnapping had become a parallel economy, enforced by fear and sustained by silence. Families learned which streets to avoid, which questions not to ask, and which losses would never be acknowledged. That year, Miriam Rodriguez Martinez's daughter, Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez, was kidnapped. The demand for ransom came quickly. The family paid, assembling money through loans and informal networks that existed precisely because this crime was so common. It was understood payment did not guarantee return. In this case, it guaranteed nothing at all. Karen did not come home. For the next 2 years, Miriam lived between hope and dread. She searched hospitals, police offices, and migrant shelters. She followed tips that led nowhere. She learned how to read official indifference and how to push past it. Like many families of the disappeared, she discovered that persistence mattered more than procedure. In 2014, Karen's remains were found. The discovery ended uncertainty but not grief. It redirected it. Miriam stopped waiting for answers and began building them herself. She started mapping connections. Names repeated, phone numbers overlapped. She learned how local kidnapping cells operated, how they recruited, how they hid behind layers of intermediaries. At times, she used disguises, presenting herself as a government worker or a volunteer to gather information in areas controlled by criminal groups. Her work produced results. Leads turned into arrests. Over several years, roughly 10 people connected to her daughter's kidnapping were detained, many based on information she uncovered and passed to authorities. It was dangerous work carried out without protection. Others began to notice. Families with missing relatives came to her for help. What began as personal revenge turned into organized resistance. Miriam helped form and lead a collective dedicated to searching for the disappeared, documenting cases, and forcing officials to acknowledge what was happening in Tamaulipas. Her visibility grew, so did the threats. She reported intimidation to authorities. Protection was minimal. Warnings were delivered anyway, sometimes indirectly, sometimes openly. Miriam continued. She had already crossed the line where fear could stop her. On May 10th, 2017, Mother's Day in Mexico, armed men broke into her home. Miriam attempted to escape. She was shot multiple times and died before she could reach safety. Her killing sent a clear message to others like her. There were limits to how much truth could be uncovered without consequence. Miriam Rodriguez Martinez did not kill the people responsible for her loss. She dismantled their networks, exposed their names, and forced arrests in a system designed to forget. For that, she was silenced. And in the next case, revenge would not take years of investigation, nor the form of organized resistance. It would happen in seconds, inside a courtroom with a weapon already in hand. Marianne Bachmeier, Lübeck, West Germany. On May 5, 1980, 7-year-old Anna Bachmeier did not come home from school. She had skipped class that morning and disappeared somewhere between routine and mistake, a gap small enough to seem harmless until it wasn't. The search ended quickly. Anna had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed. The man responsible was Klaus Grabowski, a local butcher known in the neighborhood. His arrest exposed details that deepened the shock. Grabowski was not a first-time offender. He had prior convictions for sexually abusing 2 girls and had served prison time. At one point, he had undergone castration, a measure imposed after earlier crimes, only to later seek hormone treatment that reversed its effects. To many, it felt like a system that had corrected itself, then undone the correction. Marianne Bachmeier was Anna's mother. She was a single parent, working and raising her daughter alone. After the murder, her life narrowed to court dates, police briefings, and the long wait for trial. Grief was constant, but so was anger, directed not only at Grabowski, but at the mechanisms that had allowed him to walk free again. The trial began in March 1981 at the Lübeck District Court. The courtroom filled daily with journalists and members of the public. The case had already become national news, a referendum on rehabilitation, punishment, and the risks of release. Grabowski sat at the defendant's table, alive, present. On March 6, 1981, Bachmeier entered the courtroom carrying a Beretta 70 pistol concealed beneath her clothing. She took a seat among the observers, indistinguishable from anyone else. When the proceedings were underway, she stood. She walked forward and fired multiple shots from behind. Grabowski collapsed and died at the scene. There was no attempt to flee. Bachmeier was arrested immediately. Germany reacted in shock. The image of a mother killing her child's murderer inside a courtroom fractured public opinion. Some saw an act of vigilante justice born of unbearable loss. Others saw a threat to the foundations of the legal system itself. Bachmeier was charged with murder. At trial, Her defense focused on emotional collapse and extreme psychological strain. Prosecutors emphasized planning, intent, and the public nature of the act. The court convicted her of manslaughter and unlawful possession of a firearm. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The sentence did little to settle the debate. For years, the case was revisited in media, legal circles, and public memory. It became a symbol, invoked whenever discussions turned to victims' rights, parental grief, and whether justice could survive being taken into private hands. Bachmeier served her time and was later released. She lived quietly afterward, the moment that defined her never fully receding. The Lübeck courtroom returned to routine. Trials continued. Verdicts were read. But the boundary she crossed remained etched into Germany's legal conscience. Because in the next case, the courtroom would not be the setting of revenge. It would happen in the open, after a man returned from prison and made sure the wound never closed. Maria del Carmen Garcia, Benejúzar, Spain. In 1998, Benejúzar was a small town where people knew one another's histories. That year, Maria del Carmen Garcia's 13-year-old daughter, Veronica, was assaulted by a neighbor. The crime fractured the family's sense of safety and left a mark that extended beyond their home. The man responsible was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. He was sentenced to prison. For Maria del Carmen, the ruling did not bring closure, but it created distance. Prison meant separation. Time passed. Her daughter grew older. Daily life resumed carefully. Years later, that distance ended. The man was released under legal conditions and returned to the same town. His presence was no longer confined to court records. He was visible again, occupying familiar streets and public spaces. For Maria del Carmen, the return reopened the past. The sentence had been served, but the emotional consequences had not. Fear and anger resurfaced, intensified by proximity. The breaking point came during an encounter in a local bar. The man recognized her and spoke. Witnesses later described his words as deliberate and unsettling, referring to her daughter in a way that reignited the trauma the family had spent years trying to contain. Maria del Carmen left the bar. She went elsewhere, then returned. What followed was an act that crossed from confrontation into violence. The man was severely injured and later died in hospital. Maria del Carmen was arrested and charged. The case spread quickly across Spain. Public reaction was divided. Some focused on her role as a mother, living with long-term consequences of a violent crime. Others emphasized that the act itself could not be separated from legal responsibility. She was convicted and sentenced to prison. But the case did not fade. Public campaigns emerged. Legal appeals followed. Her situation continued to surface in national discussion, not because the facts were disputed, but because the moral questions surrounding them remained unresolved. Maria del Carmen Garcia did not act during an attack. She did not act within a courtroom. She acted after the legal process had ended, when punishment had been served, but the harm had not disappeared. And in the next case, a mother would say she acted to stop an immediate threat, only to face a court that saw the moment differently. Kasturi Devi, Bulandshahr District, Uttar Pradesh, India. By the time the case reached court, Kasturi Devi was already an old woman. She lived in a rural village in Bulandshahr District, northern India. A widow, poor, largely invisible outside her community. Her life had been shaped by survival rather than law, by custom rather than courts. The incident that changed everything unfolded inside her home. Kasturi Devi said a man entered and attempted to rape her daughter. What followed was fast, chaotic, and confined to a single space. She grabbed an axe and struck him multiple times. The man died from his injuries. She did not deny what she had done. From the beginning, the case turned on interpretation rather than facts. The defense argued protection, a mother intervening to stop an assault in progress. The prosecution argued excess, that the response went far beyond what was necessary to prevent harm. Medical evidence became central. The number and placement of injuries were examined closely. Prosecutors pointed to repeated blows as proof of intent rather than impulse. The case moved slowly through India's courts. stretching across years. Kasturi Devi aged as the file traveled. Hearings were delayed, decisions deferred. The woman at the center of the case grew older while the judgment waited. In October 2021, the verdict came. The court rejected the claim of self-defense. The judge ruled that it was not necessary to strike the man multiple times to stop the assault, stating that the injuries indicated a deliberate killing rather than a protective act. Kasturi Devi was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The ruling landed hard. Public reaction was split. Some saw a legal system applying the law without exception. Others saw a rigid judgment handed down to an elderly woman who had acted in a moment of fear and desperation, with no realistic expectation of help arriving in time. Kasturi Devi was taken into custody. At her age, a life sentence was not symbolic. It was final. Her case became another fault line in a larger debate about self-defense, proportionality, and how courts measure violence when it comes from those with no power, no protection, and no margin for error. She had acted inside her own home. She had acted to stop what she believed was imminent harm. But the law did not see interruption. It saw intent. And in the final case, a mother would intervene during an alleged assault, only to see the charges disappear entirely under the weight of public outrage.